The night Rome went silent, only the screams from the palace could be heard above the Tiber's current. A torch flickered in the marble hallways of the Palatine Hill, illuminating walls painted with gold, crimson, and madness. Inside, the young Emperor Caligula stood surrounded by his sisters, wearing the crown of Jupiter, declaring himself not man, but God. The air smelled of wine, blood, and fear. Servants dared not breathe. Because that night, Caligula decided Rome would no longer belong to men, it would belong to his hunger. You've heard of emperors drunk on power. But Caligula was something else, something ancient, something primal, the kind of corruption that doesn't come from ambition, but possession. He wasn't just breaking laws, he was dissolving the line between sacred and obscene. And the first to be devoured by his delusion were the women closest to him, his own sisters, the Julius. To the Roman public, they were goddesses. Beautiful. Noble. Symbols of family purity. But behind the marble doors of the imperial palace, those same sisters were trapped in rituals that no historian dares describe completely. Caligula made them play roles in ceremonies modeled after the gods, Juno, Venus, Minerva, except the acts he demanded were not worship. They were desecration disguised as divinity. He told them, "If I am Jupiter, you are my wives." Those words weren't metaphor. They were law. Under the torchlight, he forced Rome's most revered bloodline into his personal theater of power, where love was replaced with domination, and loyalty was proven through humiliation. Every act was a performance for unseen gods. He invited senators to watch, claiming it was religious instruction. No one spoke. No one looked away. To refuse was treason. To obey was damnation. The whispers spread through Rome like a disease. Some said Caligula had descended into madness after his illness. Others swore he had been chosen by something darker, the same unseen force that had whispered to emperors before him, promising immortality through transgression. Because power in Rome was never just political, it was spiritual. Whoever controlled the gods, controlled men. And Caligula understood something most rulers never dared admit: if you want to own an empire, you must first destroy the sacred. This wasn't insanity. It was initiation. He was showing the world that in Rome, even the purest blood could be sacrificed on the altar of power, and that's exactly what he did. Because to rule like a god, he first had to kill what made him human. They called him Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, long before he was ready to die like a man. Caligula didn't just crave power, he wanted worship. He demanded it. He reprogrammed the Roman soul itself, forcing senators, generals, even priests to kneel before him as living proof that divinity could be purchased with blood and fear. Every corner of Rome began to reflect his psychosis. Statues of Jupiter had their heads replaced with his own. Temples to the gods were renamed for Caligula. Even the sacred oaths of marriage were rewritten in his honor. But beneath the politics, something more sinister was taking shape, a cult hidden in plain sight. At its center, Caligula, and his three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, the unwilling priestesses of his new theology. To the public, he called them the daughters of heaven. In private, he used them as proof that no boundary, not moral, not spiritual, not human, could contain him. He paraded them at feasts, seating Drusilla at his right hand, whispering that she was his divine equal. When she smiled, the senators trembled. They knew her laughter meant someone else's death. Agrippina, the most ambitious, learned to play the role. She bowed, obeyed, pretended to adore him. But in her eyes burned the same madness, the inheritance of a family too close to the sun. Rome itself became the theater of his cult. Night after night, Caligula staged rituals that mocked the old religion, sacrificing not animals, but faith itself. He'd stand on the balcony, drenched in moonlight, proclaiming, "The gods are dead. I am all that remains." The senators knew it was heresy. The priests knew it was blasphemy. But no one stopped him, because every man in Rome was trapped in the same invisible web, the fear of losing his position, his fortune, his head. Caligula had discovered a truth that empires still use today: control doesn't come from law, it comes from belief. Once you rewrite what people believe is sacred, you own their reality. He made the empire worship him, not because they loved him, but because they feared the consequences of not pretending to. And that's how true power is born, not through armies, but through obedience disguised as faith. They thought he was mad. But madness was only the mask. Beneath it was something older, a knowledge that every emperor since has envied: to be feared is divine, to be loved is weakness. And as Rome bowed before him, Caligula whispered to his sisters the same doctrine that would one day infect entire civilizations: when you control the sacred, you control the soul. There comes a moment when obedience no longer feels like submission, it feels like survival. That's what Caligula understood better than any ruler before him. He didn't just conquer armies, he conquered identities. His palace became a laboratory of domination, where loyalty was measured in how much you were willing to destroy of yourself to please him. Drusilla was the first to break. She was his favorite, his reflection, the one he called Venus reborn. He made her sit beside him during trials, kiss him before executions, and bless the condemned as if she were a goddess of mercy. Each act eroded her humanity until her voice, her laughter, even her tears belonged to him. When she fell ill, Caligula didn't pray to the gods, he cursed them for daring to touch what was his. And when she died, he declared her divine, forcing Rome to worship her corpse. He called her the soul of the empire. But in truth, she was its first ghost. Agrippina watched this transformation with quiet horror. She knew madness when she saw it, but she also knew power. Caligula's cruelty was a form of revelation, a test. To survive him, she had to understand the psychology of absolute control. So she began to mirror him, smiling at his humiliations, praising his cruelty, pretending devotion until her own reflection felt foreign. In private, she wrote that Rome itself was being devoured by the shadow of a god. Livilla, the youngest, tried to resist. She begged to leave, to escape the palace. Caligula answered by locking her in a golden chamber for 9 days, surrounded by mirrors. Servants said she screamed until her voice shattered, and when she emerged, she never spoke again. What Caligula created was more than fear, it was identity annihilation. He stripped his sisters of personhood and replaced it with performance. Each gesture, each word, each breath became an offering to his ego. He wasn't merely defying morality, he was engineering submission. You see, every tyrant since has learned this from him: if you can make a person violate their own sense of right and wrong, you own them forever. Guilt becomes the chain, and silence becomes the cage. By the time Caligula declared himself the new sun god, Rome wasn't ruled by a man anymore, it was ruled by a trauma. Every senator, every noble, every priest lived under the same invisible curse. They had all watched the sacred burn, and none of them stopped it. That's how psychological control works. It doesn't demand belief, it demands participation. By the 4th year of his reign, Rome no longer breathed, it trembled. The city of marble and reason had become a shrine to a living god whose mind was dissolving into something far more dangerous: vision. Caligula believed death could be conquered through desecration. To him, immortality was not earned by virtue or battle, it was taken through the violation of all that was sacred. The deeper his paranoia grew, the more his rituals turned from political theater into dark ceremony. He ordered the temples of Jupiter, Neptune, and Mars stripped of their offerings and brought into his palace. The statues of the gods, silent, ancient, cold, were forced to kneel before his throne. He told his priests that the divine essence was trapped within stone, and that he alone could free it. But that freedom came at a price. Each night, he demanded offerings not to the gods, but from them. He'd light the sacred fires and whisper invocations in languages that no scholar recognized, fragments of Babylonian, Egyptian, Phoenician, as if he were stitching together the broken tongues of fallen empires. The offerings weren't symbolic. They were physical. Blood was spilled, not always animal. And always, his sisters stood beside him, veiled and silent, as if the very air around them had become unholy. Drusilla's death had shattered something in him, but it also completed his transformation. He began to claim her spirit still spoke to him, guiding him through the darkness, demanding greater acts of sacrifice. He built her temple within the palace, decorated with mirrors, bones, and the preserved remains of her jewelry. He slept beside her statue, whispering her name like a prayer, or a curse. Agrippina wrote later that he no longer feared death because he believed he had already crossed it. That's the psychology of power at its most lethal. When a ruler believes he's beyond consequence, morality dies. The senators began to plot, of course. Whispers filled the marble corridors, daggers hid beneath togas. But what they didn't understand was that Caligula had already infected them. His madness wasn't personal, it was contagious. Rome had become addicted to spectacle, addicted to submission, addicted to the illusion that obedience could keep them safe. And that's when Caligula made his most terrifying decree. He announced a new festival, one that would merge life and death, God and man, blood and divinity. He called it the Feast of Resurrection. They said the emperor would rise from his own destruction. That night, the veil between godhood and monstrosity would be torn apart, forever. But before I tell you what happened in that final ritual, pause for a moment. If you followed this far, if you can feel the weight of what you're hearing, comment below these exact words twice: I awaken from the illusion. Because once you write it, you're not just watching history, you're remembering it. The night of the feast arrived, and the palace was transformed into a cathedral of madness. Torches flickered along marble walls painted with images of gods and emperors intertwined, and a chill wind from the Tiber carried the scent of incense mixed with something far darker: fear. Caligula, draped in gold and blood-red silk, stood at the center of the hall, his sisters positioned like living icons beside him. Drusilla's statue gleamed behind him, eyes carved as if watching every heart in the room. This was no celebration. It was an experiment in absolute control. The emperor commanded the Senate, the priests, the guards, even the servants to partake in a ritual that blurred life and death. Every act was designed to destroy what they thought they knew about morality, divinity, and themselves. Caligula lifted his hands and spoke, his voice echoing like a hammer striking the soul: "Tonight, you will see that death obeys me. Tonight, Rome will kneel not to gods, but to truth, my truth." He ordered his sisters to perform rites that no historian fully records, acts designed to break the boundaries of human decency, to force submission so complete that identity would dissolve. Agrippina trembled but obeyed. Livilla's eyes had gone hollow. Drusilla's absence haunted the room like a specter. And as the rituals escalated, a horror unfolded no one in Rome had ever witnessed. Caligula attempted to make himself immortal by sacrificing those he loved, using their devotion as fuel to transcend the natural order. The crowd was paralyzed, a mix of awe, terror, and disbelief. Some senators whispered prayers, some cursed quietly, and some, the cleverest of men, observed in silence, calculating the moment they could strike. Caligula believed he had bent reality, that life and death were now mere instruments of his will. But the universe, as it always does, has a way of correcting imbalance. That correction came swiftly. In the shadows of the feast, blades gleamed. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune betrayed by the emperor's humiliations, moved like lightning through the crowd. Caligula, intoxicated with delusion, barely noticed until it was too late. In the chaos, the god of Rome fell, stabbed repeatedly, his cries silenced by the very men who had once worshipped him. And yet, the horror did not end with his death. The palace itself had been transformed, the corruption, the rituals, the psychological torment of his sisters, all remained like a shadow over Rome. The Julius survived, but they were ghosts, bodies intact, minds shattered. They carried the weight of a god's madness, a blueprint for tyranny, a lesson in the limits of human control. This story is more than history. It is a warning. Absolute power can warp not just actions, but the very fabric of reality for those under it. And some knowledge, once seen, cannot be unseen. Caligula is dead, but the terror he unleashed did not vanish with his last breath. Rome returned to its streets and markets, to the politics and pleasantries of empire, but the echoes of his madness lingered like a disease. His sisters survived, yes, but as walking testaments to what happens when divinity is claimed by human hands. Drusilla's memory became a talisman of fear. Agrippina's ambition was forever tempered by the knowledge of how quickly obedience can turn into annihilation, and Livilla's silence became the language of trauma that spoke louder than any senator's decree. The psychological patterns he created outlived him. Generals and magistrates who witnessed the feast of resurrection carried the lesson: absolute power depends not on armies, not on gold, but on submission. Obedience enforced through fear, identity crushed beneath authority, morality rewritten in the service of domination, these were the tools that would shape Rome's elite for centuries. Every coup, every conspiracy, every whisper in the corridors of power carried the DNA of Caligula's terror. And that's the dangerous knowledge most history books ignore. Caligula's genius was not only in his cruelty, but in the architecture of psychological control he left behind. He taught Rome, and through Rome, the world, a lesson far more enduring than his short, chaotic reign, that power is most effective when it penetrates the mind, reshaping loyalty, identity, and belief before it ever touches law or sword. Think about that for a moment. The mechanisms he used on his sisters, stripping them of self, bending devotion into ritual, making them both worshippers and prisoners, were not mere acts of madness. They were a blueprint. Every ruler who follows has inherited it, consciously or not. Empires rise, rulers fall, but the invisible chains of obedience, forged in the Palatine Hall centuries ago, remain. And this is why men like you, sitting here today, should not look at history as story. You should see it as instruction. You are watching the anatomy of power, dissected and exposed. Once you understand it, you cannot unknow it. You begin to see who controls, who obeys, and how fear can be transformed into invisible authority. So pause. Reflect. Because if you followed this far, the truths you are absorbing are not passive. They are a mirror. And like the emperors before us, the moment of recognition is also a moment of choice. If you're ready to claim that knowledge, comment these words twice now: I am no longer blind. Because writing them is not just acknowledgement, it is activation. Rome moves on. Statues are rebuilt, temples rededicated, emperors forgotten. Yet the shadow of Caligula endures, not in the pages of history, but in the invisible architecture of power that governs men's minds even today. His madness was not mere spectacle, it was revelation. The acts that shocked senators and terrified his sisters were a demonstration of a truth most rulers never dare confront: power is the ability to reshape reality itself, to bend morality, identity, and fear into tools for control. Think about that. Caligula forced his sisters to embody both worship and subjugation, to perform roles that erased their autonomy, and in doing so, taught an empire how fragile human loyalty truly is. Those lessons were brutal, immediate, and intimate. He didn't merely conquer Rome, he conquered the human mind, and by extension, the soul of the empire. Every whisper, every oath, every silent compliance of a citizen or senator became a brick in the invisible edifice of domination. And this is the lesson most will never see: the most dangerous power is not military might or wealth, it is psychological mastery. The ability to compel obedience without visible chains, to induce participation in one's own subjugation, to transform devotion into control. Caligula perfected it. And the truth? That blueprint never dies. It simply waits, lying dormant, for those bold enough to learn it, or foolish enough to ignore it. So, what does this mean for you? The forbidden knowledge of Caligula is not just history, it is a warning and an opportunity. History is filled with men who believed themselves untouchable, who bent others to their will, who understood the mechanics of fear and devotion. And today, those same principles operate quietly, invisibly, in corporations, governments, and even personal relationships. Those who understand them can protect themselves, manipulate situations, and transform fear into power. Those who ignore them remain vulnerable, puppets dancing on invisible strings. Now, take a moment. Breathe. Realize that what you've learned is dangerous precisely because it is real. Caligula's shadow reaches across centuries, whispering that the line between divinity and monstrosity is thinner than you think. You have glimpsed it. You cannot unsee it. If you are ready to integrate this truth, to walk with eyes wide open, comment these words twice: I claim the knowledge. Because once you do, you are no longer just a witness. You have stepped into the realm where power, fear, and psychology converge, and where your understanding alone can change the course of your life. History tried to erase him. Rome feared him. But the lesson of Caligula lives on, and now, it lives in you.